you ever been out on a cold morning after camping out and thought, now I got to build a fire again? And you dig around in the coals and you blow away some of the dust ash, and you get down and there's that black charred wood that's still there. And it doesn't look hot. It looks like it's cold, dead fire. There's nothing there. And then you start and you maybe put some dried leaves and some little twigs on there. And then you see a little smoke coming. And you blow on it. The next thing you know, you got a fire again. Maybe even a better fire, an easier fire, quicker than what you had the night before. Because you were starting with those hot coals. Or maybe you've been out at the grill and you use charcoal. And you put the lighter fluid on there and you set it on fire and it blazes up. And you don't start cooking on it right away. That's how you burn your food, and it tastes like lighter fluid then. But then that fire settles down. It almost looks like it goes away. But there's still fire there. It's still hot. In fact, it's in some ways hotter than the flame that you see. That fire inside the wood that's there that you can't see. Or maybe sitting around and you see the burning embers, the red hot coals. Far hotter than the actual flame itself. We see Jeremiah here as this prophet, he's titled the Weeping Prophet. I don't like that title. I didn't give it to him. But that's what a lot of people know him as, is the Weeping Prophet. Because we see that through his book that he has here in the Old Testament, and then the next one, Lamentations, is also his account. And when you look through that, some of the things that he is prophesying about Israel and about Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And then in Lamentations, when he is actually walking through this wasteland of a city, seeing people cooking their food over animal dung. And we won't talk about what they were eating at the time. But it is no wonder he was upset. We see a struggling man in chapter 20. We see a struggling man in a very weak state. Because when we look at these men and women of faith in the Bible, we know what happens at the end. We know how it all turns out, and we look back and say how great they were, how strong in the faith they were, how they trusted in the Lord. And yet, so many times when we go back and we look at their story, we see that it wasn't so much that their faith was unwavering all the time. It wasn't so much that they never questioned, that they never doubted. But they did have doubts, but in the end, they remained faithful unto death. Jeremiah had a pretty rough life. He was called at an early age to be a prophet. And if we go back in just a minute to the first chapter of his book in Jeremiah, I want you to think, as we read through this section here, verses 7 through 9 or 10, I want you to ask yourself, is what he is saying God did true? Did God entice him? Did God, and that entice there, as we look there, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, but in chapter 20, verse 7, Jeremiah says, "O Lord, you induced me. You enticed me. You seduced me." It kind of has you tricked me tone to it, doesn't it? You got me to do something that was not for my good. You got me to do your will to my peril. That's kind of the tone that we see here. So ask yourself, is this true? Did God do that? In verse 7, "O Lord, you induced me, and I was persuaded. You are stronger than I and have prevailed. I am a derision daily. Everyone mocks me. For when I spoke, I cried out, I shouted violence and plunder, because the word of the Lord was made to me, a reproach, and a derision daily. And then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in my heart, like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. So we see what he's saying here, this cry out to the Lord, this plea or this accusation is really what it is. We go back to chapter 1, and as you look through there, the calling of Jeremiah, when God comes to him and tells him, here's what I want you to do, and here's how you're going to do it, and here's what's going to happen. It's very similar to the way he calls all of the other prophets, all of the other priests, all of the other servants that came before Jeremiah. And it's the same calling that we have today. God tells him, you're going to go and you're going to tell my people Israel and Jerusalem that they're doing wrong. They're living wickedly, and not wickedly in that they were bowing down to an idol. They were doing that, and that's wicked. That's evil. That's putting other false gods before the one God. But the things that they were doing in bowing down to these idols, the things that they were participating in idol worship, it wasn't just that they were burning incense. They were doing that. It wasn't just that they were making sacrifice. It was what they were sacrificing. When you go through here and you look at the high places, and it talks about these high places that the children of Israel would go up and they would worship. And they go and they cause their children to pass through the fire. It's talking about you're going to make sacrifices to a false god. Sometimes this false god is known as Molech. Other times it's known as simply Baal. They were literally sacrificing their children in fire. And so God tells Jeremiah, you're going to go and tell them they need to stop, and if they don't, they're going to be destroyed. And God goes on to say that I'm going to put this word in your mouth. And he touches his lips there in chapter 1, and Jeremiah feels this, and he knows what he's supposed to do and say, and God says, now, you're going to go, and they're not going to like it. They're going to persecute you. They're not going to make things easy for you, but I'm going to be a bronze wall. I'm going to be your support. And if you trust in me, I'll be on your side, and they will not prevail against you. Did God seduce Jeremiah into becoming a prophet? I'm the kind of person that I don't like to quit. I don't know if I've told this story, but I played high school football. And the offensive line coach, at the end of my first season, because I was this butterball in junior high. And so at the end of my first season of freshman football, the offensive line coach says, hey, you need to come out and do wrestling. I'm the head coach, and so you come out and it'll help you get quicker. I'm not real interested in that. Well, you do it for 2 weeks, and then if you don't want to do it anymore, you can quit. I hated it. I hated all aspects of it. It was exhausting. It was disgusting. I'll tell you why exactly it was disgusting, but it was nasty. Every day after school, I'd go into this concrete block room that the fan was turned off in, and just you could see the haze hanging over the room. I hated it. I didn't quit after 2 weeks, though. I couldn't quit. I've never been a quitter. But I feel Jeremiah right here, though. Because Jeremiah is struggling with a job that he knows is going to be hard. And maybe at the first, in chapter 1, he's bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, young guy, and yeah, I'm going to do that. I can appreciate that attitude as well. I'm a yes person, not a no, I'm not going to do that for you person. Yes, I'll help you. Jeremiah is willing to help, but does God seduce him? I don't know that seducing is the right kind of word. Jeremiah made a choice. He chose to obey God. He chose to place his faith in God. But God did convince. He reassured. He told Jeremiah, hey, you've got the ability. I don't want to hear that you're too young and you can't talk about this stuff. I'll tell you what to say. I don't want to hear that it's going to be hard, because I'm going to be there and I'll be your bronze wall. I'll protect you. So God reassures him. He convinces and reassures. But Jeremiah is struggling in chapter 20. He's struggling in chapter 20 because things have gotten really hard. They've gotten really tough for Jeremiah over the next 20 chapters. As he's gone, you can imagine that the people of Israel did not want to hear what he had to say. They didn't want to talk about it, and they don't want to be told that things are bad. In fact, he says here in verse 10, "For I heard many mockings, fear on every side. Report," they said, and we will report it. All my acquaintances watched for my stumbling, saying, perhaps he can be induced. Then we will prevail against him, and we will take our revenge on him. He considered quitting. But we see in chapter 12, after he asks this question of God, and we're not going to read this section here, but if you go back before verse 5, you see Jeremiah's question, and then we see in chapter 12, verse 5, God's answer. And oftentimes in the Bible, when we see man asking God a question, God's response is, it's like, wait, you heard my question, right? You're not answering my question. Well, you go back and look at Job. And Job asked these questions, and God doesn't answer Job's question. He asks Job some questions and leaves Job kind of scratching your head like, oh, okay, I don't know anything. But God tells Jeremiah, I know things are tough, but there's going to be a reason for that. He says there, if you have run with the footmen and they've wearied you, how then can you contend with the horse? If you think it's tough wrestling in the backyard with your brothers, if you think it's tough playing tackle loco in the backyard with your brothers, how are you going to strap on a helmet and pads and go out and play with the big boys in high school? And if they whip your tail, it's in Rudy's story where you go out and just a force of will, you go out there and you can compete on the collegiate level. If you can't do the little stuff, you're not going to be able to do the big stuff, God says. And so we see this progression of struggles to harder struggles to really hard struggles. We go from making fun of to not listening and mockings to plottings and imprisonment and in the stocks. All of those things happen in Jeremiah. And God says, listen, yeah, it's tough, but if you couldn't do the little stuff, how are you going to do the big stuff? Kind of like the story that Jesus tells about the talents. How are you going to be faithful with a lot of things if you're not faithful with the little stuff? With each new challenge, we should grow. We see Jeremiah go to the potter's house, instructed by God, and he goes there and he sees the potter making the clay. And there's this message that God has for Jeremiah. I'm the potter, you, Jeremiah, specifically and generally Israel. Do I not have the right to mold you into what I want? And so Jeremiah sees this, and then God says, okay, now go back there and buy a vessel and bring with you Israel. Bring with you the elders and some of the key people in town. And I want you to tell them a message from me. And the message is that you're going to be destroyed. And he does this object lesson with this pot at this place called Gehenna. And it was at the edge of town, and it was kind of a nickname of hell. It was the town dump. Before, it was the town dump. And it was just this continual burning. Always flames, always fire, where they would just go and dump their garbage. Before that, though, it was the place where they would go and take their children and sacrifice them to Baal. That's what it was before. Now it's a garbage heap, and they're going back to those sacrifices of children. And Jeremiah is there, and he's got this pot for this object lesson, and he tells them, if you don't change, the Lord is going to break you, and he smashes the pot. And they didn't like that. And so, after chapter 19, into chapter 20, we see Jeremiah put in stocks. We see him ridiculed. Can you imagine that happening to you? Being publicly shamed like some criminal? Being publicly shamed and being accused of saying something that is false. Not just a lie about somebody else, but a lie about God. God's telling me to say this. I say this, and then I'm accused by the people who are supposed to be on God's side by lying about God. And so now he's there in this community of people that he's supposed to be ministering to, and he's put in the stocks. That's where we see him in chapter 20. And that's where we see this conversation between him and God. But we see Jeremiah's resolve in that it's a fire in my bones, and I can't help but get it out. Verse 14 through 18, chapter 20. I skipped a little. Go back to 10. For I heard many mockings, fear on every side. Report, they said, and we will report it. All my acquaintances watch for my stumbling, saying, perhaps he can be induced. Then we'll prevail against him, and we'll take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me as a mighty, awesome one. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and will not prevail. They will be greatly ashamed, for they will not prosper. Their everlasting confusion will never be forgotten. But the Lord of hosts, you who test the righteous and see the mind and heart, let me see your vengeance on them. For I have pleaded my cause before you. We see Jeremiah kind of going back and forth here, don't we? We see him concerned. We see him in despair. We see him wanting to quit. And then he says, I'm not going to quit. And then we see him praising God, but then we see him seeking revenge on those people. You ever feel like that? You ever feel like not even so much that you want things to be right, but you want people to be punished for their wrong? See, Jeremiah, just like every other example of righteous people in the Bible, not everyone, but many of those men and women of faith that we hold up, and rightly so, are struggling here. He's going back and forth from quitting to staying the course. He's going from praising God and putting his trust in him to wanting God to punish those other people for the bad things they've done. Verse 14. Cursed be the day in which I was born. Let not the day be blessed in which my mother bore me. And then through the end of the chapter there, we see Jeremiah go into this deep, deep despair. He is struggling at this point. We see Jeremiah at the point of breaking almost, at least from this scene. We see a man of God who has dedicated his life and has been persecuted as a result, and at the point of just wanting to walk away from it all. And when you consider the context of this, I don't know that you can blame him. God was at that point many times with Israel before this, for much lesser crimes. I'll put that in print, quotes, lesser crimes. I mean, at Mount Sinai, God was wanting to completely wipe them out and start over with Moses because they formed a golden calf and were worshiping it. They hadn't even started the human sacrifice at that point. And so Jeremiah is here at the point of wanting to walk away with God. And now he's so distraught that he's cursing the day that he was born. Why didn't I die inside my mom? He says there, let that man be like the cities which the Lord overthrew, Sodom and Gomorrah. Wipe me off the face of the map. I'm done. However, Jeremiah remembers in chapter 1, verse 4. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah had a purpose. Jeremiah was supposed to go and do certain things. Jeremiah had a lot of ups and downs in his life. We've only taken a very brief look at those things. I don't know that the persecutions that we feel can compare to those that Jeremiah felt. Sometimes, though, it's like comparing apples to pine cones. You can't sometimes compare. Because what Jeremiah went through and what we sometimes find ourselves going through can be equally powerful. The message of Jeremiah, though, is that he had a job to do and he did it. He had a special job that he was supposed to go and do. What if Abraham hadn't left his father's house? What if Moses had not left Pharaoh's house? What if Moses had never gone back? What if? Well, somebody else would have. Because God's will is going to be done. But what about for Jeremiah? It was a fire inside, and he couldn't help it. Is that fire inside of you? Do you find yourself struggling under life's burdens? Whether it's persecutions from other people, whether it's life circumstances, whether it's fill in the blank. Are you struggling? Don't give up. Jeremiah knew what it felt like to just not even want to have ever been born at all. And yet, Jeremiah finished the rest of his life a faithful man, preaching the truth regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what was supposed to be said, and regardless of what was easy. He said the truth, and God, in the end, was that bronze wall. God did protect him, and God prevailed with Jeremiah. And those people of Israel, those people of Judah and Jerusalem, they went off into captivity. Jeremiah didn't, though. Keep the fire alive. Don't shut it up. Speak the truth. And you can have the fire inside, studying God's Word, knowing what God wants us to do and say. We're all called, like Jeremiah, to preach the truth. We can all be Christians by turning away from sin and having our sins washed in baptism. If you haven't done that, do so. But if you need the prayers for encouragement from the church, won't you come as we stand and sing?